had a lot of connections to kind of the more radical elements of the anti-abortion movement. Like he was real close with like Operation Rescue and those
Yes,
groups too, right? Yeah.
100%. I mean, he was very open, and he was, um, in a way, he was one of the easy ones because it was so obvious back then, even um, uh, what the intentions are. But yeah, so that's how far back it goes. And I think that we were ships passing in the night, probably, but it's been a long time since we encountered one another. But I've always followed your work, and I've really liked your work on Radical Reports. So when I saw Kim Davis sort of roll across my ticker, I was like, wow, this would be interesting to see how she's still relevant today within the structure and the changes since 2015, when she first, really put her stake in the ground and went to jail for not issuing marriage licenses to same-sex couples. So, and it's like I wrote my post, when I think of like right-wing, religious ideologues, I think a lot of you. So that's a compliment, because you're on top. I hope you take that as a compliment. So, yeah. Do you, why don't you just give a little background? Like I said, you do Radical Reports, but just give us a little background on. I know you work for PRA and some of these kind of cool organizations.
Right. So I've been a journalist and a researcher for almost 15 years. And I have been focused on kind of the American right in a broad sense for about 10 years now. As we talked about, I first started really reporting on the American right in the conservative movement back in 2013 when I was with what is now Rewire News Group. And then I was primarily focused on the anti-abortion movement and doing a lot of reporting on anti-abortion legislation in state legislatures and other kind of related issues to the anti-abortion movement and the Christian right.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also have worked as a research analyst at Political Research Associates, focused on the Christian right and the anti-abortion movement. I was the U.S. investigations editor at Open Democracy, also focused on the Christian right and its connections internationally, and did
Yeah.
cross-border investigations. And then for the last couple years, I've been publishing the Radical Reports newsletter on Substack and have focused in on kind of the radical right, what I term the radical right, which is all the various parts and sectors within the more extremist elements of the American right. So that's everything from anti-abortion extremists to far-right militia movements to neo-Nazi white supremacist movements, and also the radical elements within the Christian right and the rise of Christian nationalism. So I cover quite a bit of different elements of kind of the broader U.S. radical right at Radical Reports, and try to highlight both. Well, I try to produce my own research and reporting, and also highlight and share a lot of the other reporting that is going on from a lot of other great journalists and researchers around the country.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the short version of kind of my background and kind of what I've focused on over
Yeah.
the years.
And there's a lot of crossover with what I've done. When you say international, it's definitely an international movement. There's a whole, which we can't really get into. Let's keep it in the U.S. I was actually thinking about that earlier today. I'm like, there's so many different ways to talk about this worldwide, but for today, we'll keep it just in the U.S. Context. But so when I initially reached out to you, I wrote about Kim Davis. So Kim Davis, just a little background. She's our kickoff here, because I think to me, she symbolizes a lot of what you just said. There's the radical right meets the religious right, and whether or not you are actually involved in a militia or white nationalism, if you are participating in the kind of religious right that Kim Davis, Mike Huckabee, those people are participating in, you are a part of that larger issue of you are in that big basket. So, and at times I think that can feel a little disjointed for people that aren't steeped in this world, but there's very clear connections, especially after, Donald Trump made, white supremacy go, just let it all hang out. So Kim Davis, let's start with Kim Davis. She was the Rowan County clerk in Kentucky, and she made national news when she denied, it was several couples, same-sex couples, but when she denied same-sex couples marriage licenses, and she predicated that on her apostolic Christianity, which, is also a whole other, it's, very specific kind of Christianity. But she refused to offer or to give these licenses over. And, as a show of her faith, she martyred herself to the county jail for 6 days. And so when that happened, it was such a weird transitional time because we hadn't gone through the 2016 yet. We hadn't kind of gone through, that shift towards more blatant, just white nationalism and this idea that, one man, one woman, nuclear family kind of thing. But so when she was released from jail, Mike Huckabee, and there was somebody else, I can't remember, it was another right-wing luminary, made her essentially a real celebrity. They went and sprung her from jail. She came out literally to Survivor's Eye of the Tiger playing, and Huck and her husband all stood up on stage. There was like a little stage set up. And she became this sort of martyr, this sort of symbol of, good, wholesome Christian values. And so when she came back, so that was back in 2015. And then I didn't hear much about her, honestly. You were able to find some fundraising that was going on with the National Organization of Marriage using her name. Was that in reference to the most recent news about her civil case, or was that from back in 2015?
Yeah, that was recent. So the National Organization for Marriage, which is this right-wing Christian nationalist organization that's been around for quite a long time, sent out a fundraising email. I want to say maybe it was yesterday morning, or I think it was right after the judgment was levied against her, basically raising money for her. So yeah, that was definitely recent.
So that was that. So And that's, you know, a National Organization for Marriage, if people don't know, are the ones that are really behind a lot of the things that we've seen in the, I mean, in the very, very mainstreaming of right-wing evangelical Christianity into positions of political power. And National Organization of Marriage, I'm from Iowa, and, you know, first in the nation caucuses until this year, whatever. But why that is significant with National Organization of Marriage, and why it's significant that they're using Kim Davis as a fundraiser, who's very anti-gay, very white nationalist. Why it's significant is because a lot of places like National Organization for Marriage, like the Tony Perkins from Family Research Council, all of these places really did a lot of teeth cutting in Iowa because it was the first in the nation state for the general election cycle for president. So they were able to really hone a lot of, some of the movement to oust judges, the very political, movement to oust judges, or some of these test balloon cases. National Organization for Marriage was really on the ground floor, with some other organizations, but they're significant in that because they would pour a ton of money into state level and local level races. So it's interesting that they're, taking this opportunity to latch on to Kim Davis, because, as you said, the judgment against her came out and she was found to owe one of the couples. And I think there's two sets of couples. One of the couples, at least so far, she's been ordered to pay them $100,000 in damages. And so, I think that the fact that National Organization for Marriage is fundraising off of her name says a whole lot about the relevancy. And you had mentioned reading my article from 2015 and sort of the way that things have changed with perceptions and around fundamentalist and religion and politics, essentially.
Right. Well, I would say, and for those interesting, Andy's article in The Guardian, it's from 2015. The headline is Kim Davis's Defiance Breaks the Law, but Exemplifies America's Broken Politics. If you're interested in going and reading that, which I recommend. But I think
so long ago.
Right. I think kind of the main thrust of your article and your description of the kind of current landscape of right-wing Republican politics and the influence of the U.S. Christian right, I think that remains relatively similar today.
Mm-hmm.
What I think is interesting is, as you mentioned, some of the changes in public perception. So you cited the Pew Research Center and their study, and the Pew Research Center puts out lots of different kinds of surveys. It's really in-depth research, and they produce really excellent polling data. They for some of their Religion in America studies, they interview and poll thousands, tens of thousands of Americans. So back in 2015, when you wrote this, it found that this Pew Research Center study found that over 70% of Americans identified as Christian, only 5% as non-Christian, and then of the 70%, 25% of the 70% of Christians, 25% identified as evangelical Christians. So here's where the numbers stand currently, as according to some of the more recent research, Pew Research Center polling and studies. So according to a Pew Research Center poll from December of 2021, um, now 63% of Americans identify as Christians. So that's a significant decrease, 7% over the course of nearly a decade. What is surprising is the percentage of people that identify as non-religious. That is now 29%. So fully a third of American adults don't identify with any major religion. And then there was 6% that was other. And that's from a survey of 3,937, almost 4,000 adults, which is a pretty good sample. Right.
Yeah.
When you consider that most, political public opinion surveys for campaign polls sample anywhere between 500 to 1,500 people. So this is a pretty good size.
Yeah.
And then of that subset, you have 60% of Protestants. So people that identify as Christians that are also identified as Protestants, identified as born again Christians or evangelical Christians. And they represent about 25% overall, which is about the same as it has been. So I think the percentage of evangelical Christians overall has remained the same, really, comparative to the rest of the population. But the number of people that identify as Christian, evangelicals represent, I think, a larger share now. There's a lot of reasons behind that. I think for those that are interested, kind of in who would want to dive deeper into it, for example, a lot of the mainline Protestant denominations have really diminished over the course of the last 30 years. When you think of like the Methodist Church, the Lutheran Church, the different Anglican churches, right? All these different Protestant churches have really declined over the last several decades, both in membership and kind of their influence. While evangelical churches, and this is where we get into kind of semantics a little bit, like who identifies as evangelical? So that includes anything from, a lot of Southern Baptists identify as evangelical. A lot of the people that go to non-denominational churches, like if you see a church in your neighborhood, it says something Bible church.
Yeah.
A lot of those folks are evangelical. And it depends on kind of a variety of factors, but I think a lot of people that are part of like the broader charismatic Christian community identify as evangelicals. So that's referring to the Pentecostal denomination. So that's some interesting numbers that have kind of changed a little bit over time, right?
Well, I think so let me ask you a question then, because what that makes me think is that, the consolidation of power within the federal government certainly has remained largely in whether in office or operating in the background, has remained in that evangelical money-making, money churning system. So that level is the same, whereas the rest of the people that don't maybe identify as evangelical has come down. But it's kind of a net when it comes to who actually has all the money. When we talk about politics, who has the money to fund campaigns, to fund shadow campaigns, to fund weird pacts, to fund, any of these other things. So, while it sounds great on the outside that these people are identifying as non-religious or, not this particular brand of right-wing extremist religion, and not all religion is bad. Let's not everybody, lose their minds, but this particular brand. So it hasn't it hasn't moved the needle. If anything, it feels like because that the levers of power are still pulled by white people, white males in positions of power, white male evangelicals and ladies in positions of power, it doesn't feel like that change is as significant in policymaking.
Right. Well, I think it might be useful to kind of look at a couple other recent polls to kind of pull on a few other threads here. So this is some additional data from Pew Research Center. So, and this is related to attitudes of Americans that I looked at on two specific questions that are related to this issue. So first, from October of 2022, a Pew Research Center poll found that 45% of all adults and 60% of all people that identify as Christians agreed with the statement that the founders, quote unquote, originally intended America to be a Christian nation. So that's something I think is useful to pull on. And then the second data, and this is from just a few months ago. So this is another Pew Research Center poll from June of this year, 2023.
Oh, okay.
And it found that 60% of adults and 83% of white evangelicals. And that's another thing that we might get into a little bit when we talk about evangelical Christians. Yeah. We're really talking about white evangelical Christians, right?
Absolutely.
Because there's a significant amount of Latinx and Black evangelicals that may share some of the core kind of theological beliefs and tenets and things, but when it comes to a lot of kind of these political and quote unquote culture war issues, there's a significant divide there. But anyway, so 60% of adults, 83% of white evangelicals agreed with the statement that business owners should be able to refuse to provide services if providing them, quote, suggests support for beliefs about lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender issues. So that goes to kind of the discussion about Kim Davis. So there's a large portion of Americans, a majority, 60%, that agree kind of with this idea that people that own businesses should be able to refuse services to LGBTQ folks. And I think, I haven't gone back and looked at whether or not there's any other data kind of showing any changes over time, right? Like marriage, when you look at marriage equality, right, that changed dramatically over the course of 20 years.
Yeah.
And especially after 2015, which when we're talking about Kim Davis, that'll happen in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling.
Yes.
Legalizing same-sex marriage throughout the country. The attitudes towards same-sex marriage really dramatically changed, even more so. I do think, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I do think some of that has ticked down a little bit. And I think that's related to this. And I think that when you look at the Christian right and right-wing media and Republican politicians, I think they've been pretty successful over the last few years, especially kind of during the kind of the administration of former President Donald Trump, and since then at kind of in many ways controlling the narrative around a lot of these issues. And I think that's had a significant effect, and that's why I think you see some of these numbers, especially around the refusal of services. Now, the Christian nation thing, that's tied into kind of a longer kind of project of the Christian right to kind of claim that America was founded as a Christian nation. That's a kind of been a real long running project of the Christian right. And it's gotten, I think it's become even more kind of infused within other parts of kind of the far right and even within kind of other conspiracy movements as
Yeah.
well.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it's important to kind of understand what's affecting these numbers.
Well, it's interesting too that, I can't, so the refusal of service is it's an interesting question because, based on LGBTQIA status versus, this is a really simplified way to think about it, but you can't walk into a store, the no shirt, no shoes, no service. I think everybody gets the idea that private business owners can set rules for what goes on in their establishment. But what you and I are talking about with this poll is that they're actually talking about denial of service based on, a person's sexual orientation. To me, it's akin to housing discrimination or anything else that has been, that's at least in federal law is illegal to discriminate based on race, color, etc. for housing. In practice, there's plenty of ways to get around it. But so I think that it's very telling to me that the private sector, that number is actually as high as it is, about that specific group, and that LGBTQIA folks are still very much the focus of whatever is going on. So the term culture war I hate, but I don't know if we have a better way to talk about it just yet. But within the broader context of social justice movements or reproductive, freedom, that the way in, it's still, against the gays. It seems to be
Right.
a real strong point.
Well, I think it's also important to understand kind of how a lot of this is impacted by the framing of these movements, right? The rhetorical framing. So when the Christian right and the right wing talks about these issues related to denial of services to LGBTIQ folks, they frame it within the context of religious freedom,
Right.
right? That has been kind of their framing mechanism. I also think it's kind of important and instructive to put this within a broader context, a historical context, to understand kind of the Christian right strategy and where they've come, and kind of to understand what their focus is. So, you mentioned kind of the power of white evangelicals and the U.S. Christian right. I think it's also important to understand how the Protestant white evangelicals allied with and partnered with
The Catholics.
the Catholic Church, right? The conservative
Yep.
portion of the Catholic Church, the U.S. Catholic Church, the
Yep.
Catholic right.
Yes.
And so back in 2009, they put together this statement, which now the name of this statement escapes me offhand, because there was a Nashville statement, there was another statement. They put out all these different statements. So anyway, within that alliance, there has really been three main focuses that they have come together to agree on, right? And one is opposition to abortion, with the purpose of overturning Roe, but also um, um, eliminating legal abortion in the U.S. Also, opposition to same-sex marriage,
Sure.
and legal rights for LGBTIQ folks, and then within a kind of a broader umbrella, the idea of religious freedom, which from their kind of perspective and their framing of it is basically the idea that Christians should be able to kind of have lots of exemptions to any kind of these different laws, right? And that has come into play recently with, you know, Kim Davis is a good example, but also pharmacists, right? Denying people access to not just not even medication abortion, but we're talking about Plan B, right? Plan B pills, which is not an abortion.
In that, because we'll talk about that in relation to the AGs. That's something I'm very concerned about. It's not
right.
But go ahead.
And so I think when the Supreme Court ruled in Obergefell and legalized same-sex marriage, I think there was a mistaken belief, or at least a narrative, kind of a mainstream narrative, that the Christian right and kind of right-wing Republicans were going to have to kind of come to terms with the fact that same-sex marriage is now legal. You're going to have to get used to rights for LGBTIQ folks. You're going to have to abandon that kind of one of those core tenets, and that was never going to be the case, right? A lot of this activism and legislation around religious freedom, like broadly speaking, when it comes to everything from abortion to what's taught in schools, is part of an effort to chip away at all the gains made by LGBTIQ folks over the last few decades, right? It's to chip away at that. And there's a lot of people within the Christian right and kind of the broader conservative movement that haven't given up on the idea that Obergefell can be overturned, especially since the current Supreme Court recently overturned Roe v. Wade, right? I think that really invigorated a lot of folks within the movement to think, okay, we got that overturned. Why can't we go for marriage equality next? And so I think it's important when we talk about all this stuff to know that it's all part of a long game strategy by the U.S. Christian right to like chip away at all of these things and to constantly be pushing the envelope in a lot of different ways.
Well, oh, sorry. I mean, go ahead. I didn't mean to.
I was done with my thought.
Oh no, I was just going to say that, you know, you're right when you brought up like school curriculum and all these other things. You know, it does truly bleed into every segment of civil society. You know, when you talk about the religious freedom, you know, these are the same people that claim that separation of church and state was never meant to be separation of church from government, you know, so they have all these theories, to your point. And there is that, you know, whether it's returning prayer to school or federal funding through vouchers, which we've seen, which is largely, you know, Moms for Liberty, which we can talk about and should talk about. But they've done, you know, a hell of a job organizing, you know, from curriculum to so-called consciousness clauses with like to your point about the pharmacists and the Plan B, et cetera, and to, you know, those heroic cake bakers that just will not bake queer folk, you know, wedding cakes. It's in so many aspects of civil society. And none of it's surprising. It's still semi horrifying, but it's for people that have been watching this for a long time. It's kind of like, yeah. And also I'd like to tack on to there too is voting rights. You know, very much is a tied into the overall, you know, white nationalist, you know, radical right-wing evangelical movement. You know, that's just part of it as well. So across the board.
Well, speaking of voting rights, I think it's instructive to understand how the Christian right and kind of the right wing will use and manipulate the tools of democracy, right, in order to achieve their own gains, right? And there's not an ideological consistency behind it. And what I mean by that is what is going on currently in Ohio, right? So the anti-abortion movement has famously had many, many defeats at the ballot box, right? When it comes to putting initiatives on ballots to restrict access to abortion or even outright ban abortion in places as varied as like Mississippi to Colorado. Those kinds of initiatives have always dramatically failed by wide margins. You know, we're talking 10, 20 points. And what is happening now in Ohio is you have reproductive justice activists and everyone within kind of the broader reproductive freedom movement that is trying to use that mechanism of the ballot initiative to enshrine protections for abortion rights, right? And access to abortion and reproductive health care. And the right is trying to curtail that by restricting, I'm not sure the details, but I think restricting how that can happen and how many signatures you need and and what percentage of the vote. And this is also happening in a state in which the Christian right and the right wing and Republican use that same mechanism to ban same-sex marriage back in 2004 when George W. Bush was running for re-election. That was kind of part of the deal. The Christian right and Republicans, they put all these different ballot initiatives on within several states to push out the evangelical kind of conservative base out to vote for George W. Bush.
Absolutely.
And so when it comes to voting rights and kind of the tools of democracy, you see that the right is willing to really bend and change the rules because they essentially believe that the ends justify the means, right? When you have a movement that believes that abortion is essentially murder, when you have a movement that thinks that you know, the LGBTIQ folks are a threat to children, right? They have successfully, especially within the last 5 or so years, demonized several marginalized groups within our society. You have a movement that is willing to, feels justified in, you know, curtailing democracy or bending the rules in whatever way they think is appropriate in order to achieve their results because they feel justified in doing so.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of I think important to understand too.
No, yeah, and I think that that's, you know, even down to, so building off of that, they have to maintain power. So then comes the gerrymandering of districts. So, you know, whether it's, you know, we need less Black folks or Latinx folks voting, we're going to gerrymander. And I know that, and just again, because I'm from Iowa, I keep up on all things Iowa. They really did try to do that last session, but, you know, I don't know how it didn't get through, but Iowa just has a tradition of having the Legislative Services Agency sort of do the nonpartisan districting versus they were trying to make a political process. And they were trying to make it a political process to gerrymander, you know, so they can stay in power, because even though it's Iowa, there is a shifting demographic. But one of the other things too is that, yes, you know, you touched on trotting out these ballot initiatives at a state level that really drive out the vote, and certainly it's marriage equality, certainly it's abortion. You know, in different states trying to add amendments to their own constitutions. I think that one of the things I want to bring it back to is when, you know, again, in Iowa, we had a longstanding, I don't know where you are. Are you up north?
No, I live in Texas.
Why was I thinking that you were up north?
I don't know.
Hell. Sorry. I was like, aren't you in Minnesota?
I mean, I don't have a very thick like Southern Texas accent, but I definitely
No.
don't sound like I'm like from Minnesota or,
No,
you know,
no.
Boston or something like that.
Oh God. What was I think? You know what I think yeah, I don't know. I think for some reason, whatever. You're in Texas. Okay, you know. But no, so Iowa again, we had a longstanding AG, Tom Miller, who was like kind of just a real stalwart guy, Democrat, been in for a couple of decades. And along came Brenna Bird, who literally ran a campaign called Give 'em the Bird. And all of this ran. I mean, I would go home and visit my mom, and I'm like, what is happening? That this very, and it says a lot of things about my fellow, my home state of Iowa. But the point is that she was homeschooled. She's part of the sort of inner circle of the, whether it's Moms for Liberty or what was the one that sort of preceded that? That were anti-mask, anti-vax, was it Moms for Liberty? I can't remember.
Yeah, Moms for Liberty really came out of
The COVID.
within the last few years. It was it came out from kind of a lot of the right-wing activism and conservative activism kind of during COVID and the last few years.
Yeah. So Brenna Bird ran against longstanding, very serious man who was a great AG, very fair, whatever. And she won. And she won because Iowa has swung so far and so fast to the right. Now what she's doing, which is what people, in the state who are very up on these, watching these seemingly unimportant sort of statewide elections, this was the one that we were worried about. We knew that, unfortunately, we weren't going to, win the governorship. We knew that it was going to be a long shot to really turn any seats in the House or legislature. The big one was the Attorney General. And now that Brenna Bird is in office, she unilaterally made the decision to withhold crime victims assistance, which comes through the DOJ to help, from federal forfeitures, from, no taxpayer money, but from, people that have been tried and adjudicated. She made the unilateral decision to stop covering emergency contraception for rape and incest victims. This is the thing that is concerning. Sorry about the siren, everybody. Sorry about the siren. So this is the kind of thing that we're talking about now, is that and then, emergency contraception is part of standard practice in sexual, assault exams. It's offered, same with, whether it's antibiotics or, counseling, whatever it is covered by the victims fund. And so so this is concerning, because I see the way that this is impacting Iowans and victims. I see what's happening in Alabama and the recent case that's been brought against their AG. And so it's concerning because they're putting, it feels like they're populating to a level that eventually the federal level won't matter, right? I mean, Kim Reynolds from Iowa has her own little fiefdom, and now she is able to do all of the things she's ever wanted to do. And the Attorney General was essentially the last literal man standing. And so now we have victims of rape and incest going to emergency rooms in Iowa. I should note, you won't be denied access. You won't be denied those things. You won't be denied access to EC. You won't be denied actual medical care that just because she's saying we won't pay for it. But that is definitely born out of her belief system. And it is give you a little background here on her. She was Steve King's, Iowa Representative Steve King's staffer for a very long time. And Steve King was also Kim Reynolds' campaign manager. So, I mean, and Steve King is white nationalist. I mean, if there's anybody that is like really letting it all hang out. So I guess my point is that it's gone. It's school boards. I mean, never did I think that I would see such contentious school board elections. I never did think that I would see the ouster of a very serious, stalwart, very nationally respected AG like Tom Miller lose to somebody who ran on Give 'em the Bird. But it's also this fervor and this sort of, to me, it's all part of that same, white nationalism is part of that white right-wing evangelical movement. I mean, that's right.
Right. I think it's instructive I think there's some people that I really respect. Robert P. Jones, who's written a lot about this, and Bradley Onishi, who and others who have come to basically combine those two terms of white nationalism, Christian nationalism, right? We're talking about white Christian nationalism.
Right.
And I think there's a couple threads that I'd like to pull on there.
Yeah.
One is when you talk about AGs,
yeah,
and the rights kind of use of the Republican Party, the conservative movement over the last 20 years has really been successful in many ways in wielding legislative power, right?
Yeah.
And passing lots of legislation to varying degrees. But I think, and that's been well documented and well covered within kind of all parts of media. I think their usage of elected offices, like particularly the AGs and other agencies within state government, has been less well documented. And so I think when you talk about attorneys general, I think it's important to note that the Christian right has really built up this army of lawyers over the last 30 years. And they've done so by creating essentially this pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
And it begins both in private Christian schools, and then more recently, there's been a kind of a larger influx of the Christian homeschool networks, right? Mm-hmm. So you have those two where you're raising and kind of nurturing these young Christian nationalist activists, which is what they actively kind of seek to instill young men and women with this idea of they are spiritual warriors, right? Mm-hmm. Very explicit language around that kind of stuff. And then they go on to these various private Christian colleges,
Mm-hmm.
places like Regent University or Liberty University, Dallas Baptist. There's just so many of these different private Christian colleges that are well funded, and they get the same kind of education there. And then you have a collection of these various law schools attached to a lot of these Christian colleges. And if you look at anything from, say, who were the staffers in the Trump administration, like
Mm-hmm.
what law schools did they go to? Who are the staffers within these large, prominent conservative organizations, from the Heritage Foundation to Family Research Council, to who are the staffers that are within these staff lawyers within these attorney general's offices. You're going to see they all share kind of all these same alma maters. They have all gone to these similar law schools, particularly kind of Regent and others
Mm-hmm.
like that.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to that, they have these training programs. You have all these various Christian legal firms
Mm-hmm.
that, with Kim Davis, it was, I think it's
Liberty, wasn't
Liberty, right? Which is one of these organizations, these legal firms that take on all these different cases.
it? Mm-hmm.
And then, and so you have organizations like Alliance Defending Freedom, which is probably the largest of these organizations, and they run this program called the Blackstone Legal Fellowship, which they have these law students come out to their headquarters out in Arizona. They go through these various courses where all this these really kind of radical conservative legal theories are taught. I think a name that folks might be kind of familiar with now is Jonathan Eastman. Like this, a lot of these radical kind of legal concepts come from places like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, and you have these young law students that go off and either go work in the nonprofit sector at these various right-wing Christian right organizations. They go off and they work as staffers for like Republican
Mm-hmm.
administrations or for Republican lawmakers, or a lot of them go into attorney general's offices. So they have this army of lawyers, basically, that they've created over the past 3 decades that know how to kind of wield the law and kind of use these radical kind of conservative legal theories. And in addition to that, so you have this kind of are like kind of the legal apparatus.
Mm-hmm.
You also have a lot of these other agencies within state governments that have been weaponized by Republicans and the conservative movement. For example, departments of health
Yeah.
have been staffed with people that
are crackers. You can say it. They're crackers. I mean, just in my experience reporting on this. Yeah.
I was going to say that are adamantly opposed to abortion rights, for example, right? And that are going to be hostile towards everything from conducting inspections at abortion clinics to kind of how these onerous regulations are enforced, right? And so that has happened across state government. And then to kind of bring it back around, the last thing I'll touch on is, you mentioned the school boards.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to understand that that has been a long running strategy within the Christian right and various parts of the conservative movement to really attack at the local level as well. Mm-hmm. I think, famously, Steve Bannon, who's former Trump administration official, right-wing, very prominent right-wing figure, very kind of influential within far-right populist politics, has been advocating for many years for folks to kind of the far right to take over local Republican precincts and like local government. That's been a thing he's
I mean, like
promoted for a
down
while.
to the county level, county supervisor level.
Right. But even before him, this strategy was implemented. Right. I think a really good example of it is the anti-abortion movement. Was using city council meetings and county commissioner meetings to try to pass so-called abortion sanctuary ordinances, right? That's been, and they've been really successful at that. And so I think it's really important to understand that, Roe v. Wade got overturned. Now the abortion issue goes back to the states, quote unquote, as Republicans had said for years, right? That this would just go back to the states. And so in the states where there are Republican majorities, they've been able to like essentially either outright ban it or highly restrict it. But it would be a mistake to think that, say, if you're in a state like Michigan, or even that's a relatively blue state, or even a really deep blue state like California or Washington, anti-abortion activists aren't going to be satisfied with having, about half of the states ban abortion and the other half be protected, right? They really want a national abortion ban, which was just really hilarious to see how not just Republican politicians, but all these anti-abortion activists and people within the Christian right saying, oh, no, this could go back to the state. And like the next day after
national ban
was overturned, we want a national ban. We want 20-week, 15-week, whatever it was, even down to 6 weeks. It was like a quick turn of, but so that's what they want. But I think outside of kind of the hardliners, most of them understand that that's not kind of, we're in our current political reality, it's not feasible right now, right? Because of the way the Senate works and everything.
Right. Yeah.
But I think it's a mistake it's like, just because they've been able to ban abortion in most of the states they control, they are still going to come after abortion everywhere it is in any way they can. And that goes from, you see states, Republican lawmakers trying to ban travel out of state to access abortion.
That's the Alabama thing, right? So
right.
That's the thing that Robin, you know Robin Marty. She used to work at, that's where the Minnesota is coming from. I don't know. It's all Rewire.
And for those of you who don't know, Robin Marty, she
was
a longtime reporter at Rewire and many other places. Reporting and Cosmopolitan magazine to, I think she wrote Political, all over the place. She's now
American Independent Network, like all of those things. Yeah.
Right. She's now is she the executive director?
I believe so. Yes.
Of what's the name of
Alabama Women's Health?
Right.
Alabama Women's Health Clinic.
So she's fully within the reproductive justice activism now. She's kind of left journalism for the most part, but we've known Robin for years and years.
And she actually, and this has also got me, I reached out to her too, because I do want to speak to her, because it is a desperate situation, because they do want to ban people that take somebody to a neighboring state, which is something they swore they weren't going to do. To your point, it's like, no, we'll just, we're not going to do anything. We're not going to criminalize doctors. We're not going to do, it's like, you're doing every single thing that we knew you would, but that you were saying out loud sounded reasonable. Right. And so I know that that's something that I was watching actually Robin the other day on an MSNBC show, and she's like, we can't even refer people, because we don't know what's going to happen. And so that's that lawsuit against the AG there. And, there's the abortion, but there's also and I do want to bring it back to the emergency contraception for rape and incest victims in Iowa. I mean, that, to your point, when you were talking about so-called consciousness clauses, Plan B is not even an abortifacient, right? But that is part of, honestly, the white Christian nationalism that Steve King actually said out loud, that he didn't know if we as the white race would have made it this long without rape and incest.
Well, also, I think it's instructive to understand like just how successful their rhetoric and framing is
Yeah.
in the fact that you said the word abortifacient, which
Right.
isn't really a thing,
No,
right?
not at all. I know better.
but we and especially I think this is a problem within kind of mainstream journalism, kind of journalists that cover this. There is a tendency to kind of uncritically kind of quote or use kind of the language
Yeah.
of the not just the anti-abortion movement. You see it now within all of the anti-LGBT IQ activism too. Kind of there's a way in which the right manipulates the media into kind of using their framing to like and that what that does is then legitimizes it, like it legitimizes that this is just a legitimate idea, um it's the NPR effect, this side says one thing, this side says the other, right there. And so it's and I think to kind of bring it all the way back, I think that's, we were talking about the public opinion on these issues, and I think that's been kind of where it's been most successful, is pushing those numbers down. I think I think I may have mentioned this, but like we've seen the numbers, public opinion polls around LGBTIQ issues and rights changed and nudged in different ways over the past couple of years as the right has really focused in on the LGBTIQ, particularly the trans community.
Yes.
Right. And it's but it's all part of kind of a much larger strategy. I think what the right has been, I mean, they've been good at a lot of this, which is what the right has always been really good at is, and not to quote Steve Bannon, but I kind of have to, the flooding the zone thing, right? They have always been really good at throwing as much kind of against the wall as possible to overwhelm their opponents, right? That's, that was a big part of the strategy leading up to the overturning of Roe v. Wade, like, introducing bill after bill after bill to restrict abortion all these different ways, to ban abortion all these different ways. So there's all these different court cases. So that means that the proponents of reproductive rights have to take on those different challenges, right? There's so many different legal cases. The same thing is happening now with LGBTIQ rights. How many legal cases are there right now around things like everything from gender affirming care to the ability of trans folks to use the bathroom that coordinates to their gender identity, right? So there's all these different things that are going on that is flooding the zone. And yet the right has built this giant infrastructure around kind of that strategy. So they have all these different kind of, we mentioned it earlier, all these different legal organizations that take on all these different cases. And there's so much funding behind it. And that's kind of one of the things, as someone that has spent so much time kind of studying the right, I think one of the things that I get probably most frustrated about is kind of, as I mentioned before, this kind of both sidesism in different ways. And there's such an asymmetry to not just kind of the strategies, but how the right is funded and how it's created these different structures, right? People can argue whether or not, I don't know, whether or not Fox is similar to MSNBC, whatever. There is kind of no similar structure on the left, compared to kind of all these different Christian right law firms and these Christian right and these conservative legal schools, right? All of what we would consider kind of that part of the progressive movement, everything comes out of like traditional kind of either Ivy League or private,
Mhm.
you know, um, and similar kind of the right also has this giant right-wing media
Yeah.
infrastructure. You know, they have everything from the Daily Caller to the Daily Wire to all these different websites and media platforms. That doesn't exist on the left.
No,
Like
not at all.
there's some progressive media, but it's nowhere near the size and scope of right-wing media.
No.
And so I think, you know, the right has just been the right has always over the course of the past 40, 50 years taken the long view of everything and, you know, planned accordingly and thought in terms of decades, right? How they've been trying to overturn Roe v. Wade. It took them 50 years, but it
But they
was
did it.
a
Yeah.
long-standing focused goal, and they never really kind of deviated from it, right? It
Mhm.
was always within their architecture. And I
Oh,
think
but that's because it fits within the hierarchy of the white male supremacy, right? So it's all in service of that. So even white women who, you know, vote wrong and apparently enjoy, you know, withholding emergency contraception from rape victims, that allows them to be sort of the handmaidens on the right. Whereas, you know, and so there's that certain, it's a certitude that can only come with a belief, a self-righteous belief in something that is greater than yourself, yet you are here on the earth to do the mission of that deity, you know. So it's hard to come up against that
well,
kind of.
that's why the right has so often targeted the marginalized
Mhm,
communities, right?
mhm.
That's everything from undocumented immigrants
Yep.
to you know, poor people of and communities of color to the LGBTIQ folks, because you know, if you were just, you know, a working class, middle class white person, right, and you're not necessarily seeing the kind of detrimental effects of all
Mhm.
these different policies, and in some cases, kind of the very real threat of physical danger and violence,
Yeah.
both from the state and from far right extremist actors,
Yeah.
that it is. That's why I think it's there's so many people that are among that 60% that think, well, okay, it's a religious freedom, whatever. If you don't want to serve gay folks if you don't want to make a gay person a cake, maybe you shouldn't have to, right? There's just a lot of folks, I think, as um, I've gone to quoting.
Oh my God, are you going to quote Steve Bannon again?
No, I was going to say I've gone from quoting Steve Bannon to now Martin Luther King, the
Okay.
white moderate, right? I mean, it's you have these folks um, that are kind of in the middle that
Hmm.
as long as it doesn't affect them, it's easy to ignore,
Hmm.
right? And I think that's why, unfortunately, especially when it comes to things like abortion rights or LGBTIQ rights, you don't see things change until it starts affecting kind of the white moderate, the people in the suburbs. That's why, you know, we had a crack epidemic that happened within the urban areas in the inner city within the black community, and you know, white America didn't give a shit. But then suddenly there's opioid epidemic within rural America in places like Ohio and Indiana, right? All of a
Everywhere. Yeah.
sudden there's a drug problem that we need to address, not with criminalization, but with actual healthcare, right? And
Right.
so I
Right.
think when it comes to something like abortion rights, there's unfortunately there's going to be a lot of women of color and poor women that are going to get either criminalized or that are going to suffer health consequences because of all this. It's going to take, you know, white women in the suburbs basically being charged with murder for having a miscarriage, right, or something like that. It
It's going to take a lot of that, though.
right
Unfortunately.
because of how the right has targeted their kind of goals. it's made it easier for kind of the white moderate and mainstream Americans to kind of ignore it,
Yeah.
like, because it's not affecting them.
Yeah.
I think to kind of hopefully kind of end on a more positive note, I think where we have seen things that have changed with that regard within kind of LGBTIQ rights, we've seen things like conversion therapy really be pushed back against. Like, there's not a lot of success in defending conversion therapy anymore, in large part because of grassroots activists basically kind of borrowing from the right-wing playbook and going town to town, state by state, county to county to ban that conversion therapy for minors, right? That's been a really successful campaign. And as more and more, and as you see the right really target the trans community, right, and the queer community, as more and more people see how that affects kind of everyday people in their lives, right? Yes, trans folks are a really relatively small percentage of the population. I think it's like 2-3% or whatever it is. And, but there's a lot of folks within the queer community and the LGBTIQ community. I guarantee, like, there's somebody within your family, somebody on your street that's within that larger community. And so I think when people actually see kind of how that affects people in everyday lives, the same way it did around marriage equality, like, I think it changes people's perception. But unfortunately, so often we have to see the harm actually take place before we're willing to do anything. I think another example of that is police brutality, institutional racism.
Yeah.
We had so many white folks had to see black folks get shot and murdered by police and law enforcement before they believed anything. But unfortunately, even when that happens, there's always going to be the backlash. There's always going to be the pushback, as we've seen the last year to, the pushback against Black Lives Matter and the whole idea behind critical race theory. Well, so it's a never ending battle and pushing back and forth.
Yeah.
But I think if you're kind of looking for some hope within all this, I think there is so many people, they're doing the really hard work on the ground. People like Rob and Marty. Absolutely. Or people like Laurie Bertram Roberts, who's also out there. Yeah. Or, so many of the folks that are doing the like reproductive justice work, immigrants' right work, whatever, in places like Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, New Mexico, Tennessee, Kentucky. There's a lot of people doing that kind of really great on the ground grassroots organizing. Yeah. I mean, in places like Ohio, where they're trying to protect abortion rights. I think that's when you see the progressive movement be at their best and be the most successful, it's when grassroots activists kind of take things into their own hands, right? And don't wait for Democrats or whatever politicians to kind of
that ship sailed, right? I mean, so here's my turn your frown upside down moment for this, because I think you're right. So again, going back to Iowa, because I can't get away from it, even though I'm in New York now. I'm sure you're familiar with the constitutional sheriff's movement. We won't get into all of it, but essentially they use the power of the county to create gun sanctuary counties. And we've seen this happen out west, right? So when all of this stuff came down in Iowa, Iowa has home rule. In 1975, it was codified into Iowa law that counties were allowed, to essentially legislate themselves as long as it didn't, infringe on federal or certain state law. So they have purview over their own county. So with reference to the not paying for emergency contraception and abortion for rape or incest victims, Polk County passed an ordinance that they were going to fund emergency contraception and abortion care in Polk County, Iowa. Then Johnson County did the exact same thing, where they said, we are paying for abortion care and for emergency contraceptive care for our victim services in our county. Now that one of the next counties is Lynn County, Iowa, which is looking at doing the same thing. So it's taking this sort of, it's a power that can be used for good or evil. And in this case, the power of like home rule from a county level, that gives me hope, is that there's people that are thinking like that on the ground, and they're taking a lot of heat for it. Those supervisors can take a lot of heat for doing those kinds of things, but it's the right thing to do. So I think that's my hope, is that, and a lot of awareness around the Moms for Liberty movement and all of these things have really involved a lot of that sort of, white middle, and so hopefully some of that will start to shift. I wish it didn't have to get to that point, but I think that there's some baby steps that are happening to try to push back, at least on a hyper local level, which is going to make a hell of a lot of difference to a hell of a lot of people in those communities. So that to me is that sort of like trying to turn my frown upside down situation. But well, so I could talk to you all day, but I won't. So
well, I can come back anytime. We can
absolutely.
There's a lot of topics that we kind of left on the editing room floor here.
So many. I mean, we didn't even touch Oath Keepers. So, who, oh God, anyway, that will have to be, and we'll have to get, Jess Pishko, who's doing work on sheriffs. Do you know Jess?
Yes. Yeah.
He is.
Yes.
She's a fellow that does a lot of research into, and I think she's working on a book. She's in Texas. And she
also has a Substack newsletter too.
Oh, she does. That's right. I have her newsletter. Yes. She keeps me up to date on all of the hot gossip in the constitutional sheriff's world, which is actually very informative. Left-wing folks, very informative.
And if people are interested in finding her newsletter,
yes, please.
You can find her on Substack. Her newsletter is called Posse Comitatus.
That's what it is. Yes, the power of the county. Yes, she and I spoke. I will have to dig up my a couple years ago. She and I, when I was doing a podcast, she came on and talked to me about the constitutional sheriff movement, and we got into a lot of it. I love talking about that in relation, especially post January 6th, the militia movement. So, but yeah, I would love to do that. Maybe I'll give her a ping and say, hey, you want to schedule some time? So, but that would be great. And I do thank you. This was just sort of a last minute thing that you agreed to do. And I'm going to try to do more of these. It's sort of, yeah, I think I'm going to try to do some more of these. So, and anytime you come across something that's just too crazy for words, let me know. And
well, but be careful, because I come across a lot of things that are
well, yeah, and we didn't get to talk about all of the horrible other stuff going on, all the rise in hate crimes, etc. That
right.
So.
And so if folks are interested in finding my work, I'll go ahead and plug my stuff here at the end.
Yeah, and I have links I have links and everything else in the notes here too. So absolutely, right. Go ahead.
Yeah, so y'all can find my work at radicalreports.substack.com. You can, if you want to follow my work, you can subscribe. I have a free subscription. I also have a paid subscription. If you want to support my work, it's $5 a month, $50 a year. And but yeah, that's and I'm on all the social media right now. I'm still on Twitter, X, whatever it's called, at Report by Wilson. That's my handle across everything else, from Blue Sky to Threads to whatever else there
Yeah, I can't remember.
is.
Shoutable. What is it? Mastodon? Yeah. Yeah.
Mastodon, yeah, I'm on Mastodon. I'm on Counter Social. I'm on everything.
Yeah. Do you have Radical Reports on Facebook?
Yeah, you can also follow Radical Reports on Facebook, Radical Reports on Twitter. But yeah, so
and I'm
um,
going to drop links of all of that. And I don't know if it's separate or not, but you have the visualization graphic when we talked about Moms for Liberty, and you have this amazing tool that shows how they're connected. Is that a separately funded option, or is that through Radical Report subscription?
well, I have like these two big network projects. So if you subscribe to Radical Reports, you're supporting that work too.
Okay.
But you can find my network analysis map of Moms for Liberty on Radical Reports. I also have another project that I've been working on for quite a long time now. Called it's the Capitol Riot Map. If you go to capitalriotmap.com. It has a big network analysis of all over the 1,000 people that have gotten arrested, and how they're connected to different extremist groups, and all the people that have been indicted for various things connected to the January 6th insurrection. And both on the Capitol Riot Map and the Moms for Liberty network. If you want to support those projects separately, throw in extra. I have links to my Venmo or Cash App or whatever. If you want to donate a little bit extra, you can do so. There's links there.
Yeah.
But becoming a paid subscriber to Radical Reports is probably the easiest and most helpful way to support my work, if you're so inclined.
That sounds great. No, thank you. Thank you. And if anybody has, I assume, tips, anything like that, I assume you use journalistic standards, and they can contact you at Radical Reports newsletter at Gmail?
Yeah, Radical Reports newsletter at Gmail, or if you want to email me more directly, you can DM me on Twitter.
Sure.
But yeah, and I've gotten a ton of tips and things lately, especially about Moms for Liberty. I've heard from
you with one.
Yeah, I've heard from people all over the country, from different counties, everywhere from California to Pennsylvania to Kentucky,
Yep.
to I think Montana, to other places, about kind of what's going on locally with them and how they're connected. And so yeah, and there's, especially with the Moms for Liberty kind of network analysis, there's a lot on there right now already. There's a lot more that I've kind of haven't necessarily been able to add yet, because I kind of like to have a lot of documentation evidence. Like if somebody's connected to the Proud Boys or other extremist groups, I like to be able to present my evidence of those connections before I just throw it up there. So if you send me a tip or whatever, I'm grateful, but I'm going to look into it.
Absolutely.
And also everything, like you don't have to worry about your identity being divulged or anything.
Yes.
So
absolutely.
but yeah, so thanks for having me on. It was real fun.
Yeah.
Like you said, I could talk about this with you for a few more hours.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
we'll have to do this again sometime.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll have to come up with some sort of fancy name for right-wing chats, fireside chats. So all right. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right. Take care.
Care.